Dolly Parton heard the first 3 seconds of the recording, and her smile disappeared. Not slowly, not gradually. The way a candle goes out when a window opens, immediate, complete. The warmth still in the room, but the light suddenly gone. Her hands, which had been resting easily on the arms of the guest chair, the way they rest when she is comfortable and happy and exactly where she wants to be, gripped the armrests. Her chin dropped. Her eyes went somewhere far away from the Tonight Show studio, somewhere private, somewhere that existed only inside her, and the expression that crossed her face was not grief and not joy, but the particular expression of a person who has heard something they were not certain they would ever hear again. Jimmy Fallon watched it happen and could not speak, not because he was not trying, because his throat had closed entirely. He had known the recording existed. He had listened to it 3 times in his dressing room before the show and had needed to sit down after the first time. He had thought he was prepared for what it would do to her. He was wrong. He sat at his desk, with his mouth open and his eyes filling, and his hands flat on the desk, and the confusion on his face moved through 3 stages in rapid succession. Confusion, then disbelief, then recognition, and by the time it arrived at recognition, he was already undone, stunned. Completely and entirely stunned, the professional composure gone as if it had never existed. The television host replaced by a human being sitting very still in the presence of something he did not have the words for. 300 people in that studio had heard the recording begin, and they had gone silent, and they were waiting. What came from the speaker on Jimmy Fallon's desk was not loud, not dramatic, not produced. A voice, an old voice. The voice of a very old man singing a song that the entire world knew, but singing it the way you sing something when you learned it before it was famous, when it belonged to you personally before it belonged to everyone, with a particular ownership, a particular ease, a particular unself-consciousness that made it sound like the most private version of a public thing that had ever existed. The song was "I Will Always Love You," not Whitney Houston's version, not the grand orchestral arrangement that had become one of the best-selling singles in the history of recorded music. The original, Dolly Parton's original, written in 1973, the small and heartbreaking and personal version, but sung now by a voice that was not Dolly Parton's, sung by a man's voice, elderly and slightly rough and completely steady, in a room that sounded like a kitchen, with what sounded like a wooden chair creaking slightly beneath him as he breathed. Dolly Parton fell silent, not theatrically, not dramatically. Silence just moved into the space where her voice usually was, the way silence fills a room when the person who had been filling it steps out. Jimmy Fallon could not speak. 300 strangers held their breath in the dark and waited for someone to explain to them what they were hearing and why this woman, who had stood on every stage in the world, looked as if the floor had opened beneath her. It was a Thursday evening taping. February 2024. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Dolly Parton was the guest, a living legend at 78 years old, a woman who had by this point given so much of herself to the world for so long that the world had stopped being surprised by her generosity and had simply begun to depend on it, the way you depend on certain fixed things: the seasons, the mountains, the particular comfort of a voice that has always told you the truth wrapped in a melody you cannot get out of your head. The interview had been everything the audience had hoped for. She was funny and warm and completely herself, the way Dolly Parton is always completely herself, without effort or performance, as if being entirely genuine costs her nothing at all. They talked about her new music, about the library program, about turning 78 and what that felt like from the inside. Jimmy was bright-eyed and delighted. The audience was in love with every word. Everything was easy and warm and flowing. Then Jimmy Fallon said, "Dolly, I need to play you something." He paused. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Something careful. Something that understood it was handling something fragile. He said, "Someone sent this to us, and I think you need to hear it." He nodded to the producer beside the desk. The small speaker came to life. And Dolly Parton heard the first 3 seconds of the recording, and her smile disappeared, and the entire studio froze. The band had not been warned. They heard it the same way the audience heard it, without preparation, without context, and the band director's baton stopped in midair and stayed there. 200 audience members had their hands pressed to their mouths by the end of the first verse. A woman in the 9th row was crying before the chorus arrived. The wrong assumptions moved through the room. Was this a family member? Was he still living? Was this a voice from somewhere irretrievable, played back in a television studio to a woman who had not known it was coming? Then a single whispered word cut through the sound of the recording, like a key turning in a lock. Dolly Parton said it with her hand pressed flat against her chest, her eyes still somewhere far away, her voice barely carrying past the first row, but caught perfectly by her lapel microphone, delivered into the silence of 300 people who were not breathing. "Porter," she said. And in the 2nd row, a woman in her late 70s with silver hair and steady hands reached into her lap and held on to the handbag there, the way a person holds on to something solid when the ground shifts beneath them. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1967. Because Dolly Parton wasn't always Dolly Parton. Country music legend, songwriter, the most beloved entertainer America has produced in the last 50 years. She was, once, just a 21-year-old girl from the Smoky Mountains who had moved to Nashville with everything she owned in a single suitcase and a talent so large she had not yet figured out what container to put it in. In the spring of 1967, Dolly Parton had been in Nashville for 3 years. She had a small recording contract that had produced modest results. She was writing songs constantly, dozens of them, hundreds of them, filling spiral notebooks with lyrics and melodies the way other people fill notebooks with grocery lists and appointments. The songs were extraordinary. The people who heard them said so. But extraordinary songs in Nashville in 1967 needed a particular kind of architecture around them before the world could hear what was in them. And Dolly Parton had not yet found the person who could build that architecture with her. That person was Porter Wagoner. Porter Wagoner was 47 years old and one of the most successful men in country music. A television star, a recording artist, a performer who had spent 2 decades building a reputation for finding talent and knowing what to do with it. He had a syndicated television program, The Porter Wagoner Show, that aired in more than 100 markets across the country, and he was looking, in the spring of 1967, for a female vocalist to join the show as a regular cast member. His previous vocalist, Norma Jean, had left to get married. He heard Dolly Parton on a Tuesday morning in April. She had been brought in for an informal audition by a mutual acquaintance. Nothing formal, nothing guaranteed, just a listening. She sang 2 songs, standing in a rehearsal room in a building on Music Row, with no microphone and no arrangement behind her. Just her own voice and the acoustics of a room that was never meant for performing in. Porter Wagoner sat in a folding chair and listened with his arms crossed and his eyes closed. The way a man listens when he is not deciding whether something is good, but deciding how good, and where good fits in the larger architecture of things he already knows to be true. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you been writing songs?" She told him since she was 7 years old. He nodded. He said, "Then why are you only showing me 2? She came back the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and the Tuesday after that. She brought songs each time, new ones, old ones, half-finished ones she was still working out, and Porter Wagoner listened to all of them with the same crossed arms, eyes closed attention, and then asked questions about each one that were not the questions of a producer deciding what to record, but the questions of a man who genuinely wanted to understand how a mind like hers worked. What did you mean when you wrote this line? Where did this melody come from? What were you trying to say here that the words almost, but don't quite say? She joined the show in June 1967. The partnership that followed lasted 11 years and produced some of the most celebrated music in the history of country music and in the private history of two people who worked that closely together for that long. The particular complications that closeness always produces: loyalty and friction, and love in its most difficult form. The kind that cannot be easily named or simply resolved. The kind that becomes a song when you are lucky, and a silence when you are not. The silence came in 1974. The parting was difficult in the specific way that partings are difficult between people who are not wrong about each other, but are simply unable to continue in the same direction. Dolly left the show to pursue her solo career. The breach between her and Porter Wagoner was long and painful, and public in the way that things between public people are public, observed, commented upon, reduced by the commentary to something smaller than it actually was. She wrote "I will always love you" to say goodbye to him, not to a romantic partner, to a mentor, to the man who had sat in a folding chair with his arms crossed and his eyes closed, and decided that the 21-year-old woman standing in front of him was worth every Tuesday morning she was willing to give. The song was her attempt to say, "I am leaving, and it is not because you were wrong, and it is not because I don't love you, and I will carry what you gave me for the rest of my life." He understood what the song was when he heard it. He told her so. He cried when she played it for him the first time, sitting at the piano in the same rehearsal room where she had first auditioned, and she cried too, and neither of them said very much after it was finished. The song said everything. They reconciled, slowly and imperfectly, over the years that followed. The friendship that survived the breach was quieter than what had come before it, but more durable. The way certain things become more durable when they survive being tested. Porter Wagoner died in October 2007 at the age of 80, having spent the last months of his life finishing one final album, sitting in the kitchen of his home in Nashville, with a recorder set up on the table beside the salt shaker and the sugar bowl, singing the songs he had loved for 60 years in the voice that was left to him at the end. Quieter than it had once been, slightly rough but steady, and absolutely certain of every note. His daughter, Margaret Wagoner Ellis, had been present for many of those kitchen recordings. She had kept them in a box in her home in Nashville for 16 years, along with the rest of her father's papers and effects, not because she was waiting for the right moment, but because the right moment had never announced itself clearly enough for her to be certain. Then, in the autumn of 2023, Margaret was cleaning out the box and found a reel labeled in her father's handwriting. One song, no date. The label said only, "For Dolly. When the time is right." She had not known this recording existed. She sat in her kitchen in Nashville and listened to it, and then called her brother, and then called her sister, and then called a number she found on the internet for the Tonight Show's audience correspondence department, and said, "I think my father left something for someone. I think it's time to deliver it." Behind the scenes, Jimmy Fallon had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. When Margaret Wagoner Ellis had first contacted the show, the producers had suggested a formal segment, a sit-down interview with Margaret, archival footage, a structured presentation of the recording with context provided by voiceover and graphics. Jimmy Fallon had sat through the pitch meeting and then said, quietly, no. She should hear it the way her father meant her to hear it, without warning, without packaging. He labeled it for Dolly, not for television. We play it to her directly, or we don't play it at all. Margaret had been brought to the studio that evening without being told the full shape of what was planned. She knew the recording would be played. She had been seated in the second row. She had been asked only to be present and to trust the show. She sat with her handbag in her lap and her silver hair and her steady hands, and she watched Dolly Parton on that stage the way a daughter watches something her father loved, with a pride and a tenderness that was entirely private and entirely visible. Dolly Parton had been told only that someone had sent in something the show wanted her to hear. No name, no context, just someone sent something. We think you should hear it. She had agreed without asking many questions, because she had spent 50 years in the music business and she understood that sometimes the most important things arrive without an announcement. She had not been prepared for Porter Wagoner's voice in a kitchen in Nashville, singing her song in the last months of his life, recorded for her and kept for 16 years until his daughter found the right moment. Now the studio understood everything. The recording that had been labeled for Dolly. The daughter in the second row with her steady hands. The kitchen in Nashville, the salt shaker and the sugar bowl, and the recorder on the table beside them. The song that had been written to say goodbye and had instead become the most covered song in the history of country music, and was now coming back to the woman who wrote it in the voice of the man she had written it for, singing it back to her from 16 years beyond his own death, the way certain voices refuse to entirely stop. Dolly Parton had said Porter's name and then fallen silent, and the recording had played on, and now it reached the final verse. The verse where the melody climbs and opens and asks for something the lyrics cannot quite name, only gesture toward. And Porter Wagoner's kitchen voice found that climb without effort, without strain, with a certainty that sounded less like a man singing a song and more like a man delivering a message he had been entrusted with and was determined to get exactly right. The recording ended, not with a fade. With a stop, the recorder simply switched off, and the kitchen in Nashville vanished, and the Tonight Show studio came back, and 300 people did not move or speak. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Dolly Parton stood up from the guest chair. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed one hand to her chest, and she stood. And then she turned. Not toward Jimmy Fallon, not toward the cameras, not toward the audience at large, and she looked directly at the second row. At Margaret Wagoner Ellis, at the woman with the silver hair and the steady hands, who was now crying in the quiet, composed way of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. Dolly crossed the stage and came down the steps and walked to the second row. And she did not say anything at all for a moment. She simply stood in front of Margaret and looked at her with an expression that contained 57 years of a story that could not be summarized and did not need to be. Then she reached into the inside of her jacket and produced something small. A photograph. Old, the edges worn, black and white, slightly faded. The kind of photograph that has been carried in a pocket or a wallet for a very long time, that has absorbed warmth from the body carrying it until it is no longer just an image, but a thing. A physical fact, a piece of the world that has been kept alive by being kept close. It was a photograph of the two of them, Porter Wagoner and Dolly Parton, in the rehearsal room on Music Row. April 1967. He was sitting in the folding chair with his arms crossed and his eyes open, looking at her with an expression she had not known he had been wearing until she saw this photograph decades later, because she had been the one in front of him and could not see his face. The expression was not the expression of a man evaluating a talent. It was the expression of a man who had just understood something enormous and was trying to find a way to be worthy of the responsibility of knowing it. She held the photograph out to Margaret with both hands. Margaret looked at it. Her breath caught. She reached out and took it the way you take something that proves something you have always known but were never quite sure you had the right to claim. He always said that Tuesday morning was the best decision he ever made, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said it until the very end. Dolly Parton's voice broke clean in half. She said, "It was the best decision anyone ever made for me." She sat down in the empty seat beside Margaret and took her hands, and Margaret held the photograph in her lap beside her handbag, and neither of them said anything more for a long time, because the silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had already been said, in a kitchen in Nashville, and a rehearsal room in 1967, and a song written in 1973 that had just come home. Questlove set his drumsticks down one at a time with a deliberateness that was its own form of respect. The band stood without being asked. The director in the control room was not speaking. The producer in the wing was not moving. Jimmy Fallon was on his feet behind his desk, both hands pressed flat on the surface, tears streaming freely down his face, and he was not trying to speak, and not trying to manage the moment, and not trying to bring it back inside the borders of the television program it had briefly been. He just stood and watched, with 300 people around him doing the same. The particular thing that happens when grief and gratitude find each other after a very long separation and discover that the years between them have changed nothing essential. The applause, when it came slowly. It built from the back of the studio forward. 300 people rising one by one and then all together, the sound enormous and sustained and warm. The kind of applause that is not for a performance, but for a truth. For the fact that a man had labeled a recording for the woman he had changed the life of, and his daughter had kept it safe, and the right moment had finally arrived. 16 years later, in a television studio on a Thursday evening in February, which is to say that it had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Margaret Wagoner Ellis flew home to Nashville the following morning with the photograph in her coat pocket, pressed against her chest, in the same position Dolly Parton had carried it for 20 years. She had it framed the following week. It hangs now in her living room in Nashville, beside a photograph of her father at the height of his career, rhinestone jacket, wide smile, the full gleaming fact of Porter Wagoner in his element. The two photographs are the same size. The frames are the same color. She hung them level with each other on purpose. The kitchen recording was released publicly in April 2024, on what would have been Porter Wagoner's 87th birthday. Dolly Parton wrote the liner notes herself, by hand, in 2 paragraphs. She did not describe the song or the recording or the circumstances. She wrote only, "He taught me that a song is not finished when you stop writing it. It is finished when it reaches the person it was always meant for." This one took 50 years. It arrived exactly on time. The recording was played 3 million times in its first week. Every time it was played, somewhere in a kitchen in Nashville, a recorder switched off and a voice went quiet, and the room came back. But the voice had been there. It had said what it came to say. And the woman it was written for had heard it, at last, in full. Some songs are written for everyone and meant for one person. The whole world gets to listen. But only one person gets to truly hear.